Leisure. I'm doing a PhD in Norway comparing the cabin traditions of Norway and Scotland. We have 600 basic huts that people use a weekend. They have 368,000. And that, you can say to me, but is that perhaps farmhouses? No, that total brings it to 429,000. But is that perhaps that they have huts in other countries? No, you can add another 50,000 on for that. Is that bothies, because we have that Mountain Bothy Association? No, they have a DNT association where all the huts are owned by the DNT association. The Mountain Bothy Association merely rents what the landowner feels inclined to give some temporary access to. And what does that mean? It means people have a ball. It means people are constantly able to move, get away from the stress of daily living. And the number one thing that every cabin society registers as the biggest benefit of having a cabin, and bear in mind here, if you've been watching television recently, you'll have seen all the Nordic dramas centred around people's huts. You'll have spotted even Top of the Lake, if you watch that, had batches and cribs. The New Zealanders have the same pattern. The Germans have Schrebergarten, where people can escape within cities. The Americans, the Canadians, the Finns, the Russians with their Dutches. We're weird. Again, we're weird. We're the only country at our latitude with semi-wooded environment which doesn't have a tradition of huts and cabins. Why not? Land ownership is pretty straightforward, but before that, if you never could even aspire to being the owner of a house from which you could not be ejected within 6 months for your main house, do you think we were really going to try and push for a second one? And that's been our story. So to come back to this, the number one reason that all these nations give uniformly, whether they're in the northern or southern hemisphere, is connection with the family. Surprising, isn't it? It's not getting away from it all, chilling, relaxing, getting fit. Those things can happen. It's connection with the family. And then when you're there, they ask you, how do you connect up with your family properly? And you realise you don't. They say, but at Easter, where do you all go? I don't know, do we do things at Easter? Not really. They'll gather around the biggest huts. Sometimes they even have huts outside huts. And they'll have ropey extension cables that our health and safety guys would be, whoa, no, to simply swing 3 or 4 huts together. There'll be 30 people in each hut. I ended up in someone's hut in Hammerfest with 2 people in the same bed. I didn't even know who they were. It's an acquired taste. But it's fun. It's great fun. And people from their huts are going off to do extraordinary things in the middle of the winter. At the time when people most need to be active, these guys are out all the time they can possibly be out. So it kind of matters, and what it strikes me is, when you get, let's look at what the costs are. In Norway, land is cheap and affordable, so people have huts. In Scotland, land is not cheap and it's not accessible, so you don't have huts. And what you do have is a preoccupation with what is cheap, and drink's cheap. We are eating our wealth. We consume our wealth. We have the same profile of consumption as third world countries, because we don't have connection with the resources that would let us, if you like, have added value to style of lives. And by we, I mean the vast majority. I'm looking at the feminine average here, not the exceptions. So here's huts in Scotland. These are huts in Barry Downs. This was set up in 1937, when probably a landowner was away during the First World War and met some of the men he never normally met. And most of the hutting society communities in Scotland began like in this period. Carbeth, for example, was the same. So the huts began, people got a little foothold there, and they loved them. Barry Downs was probably the prototype for the Broom's Bottom Ben. It's near Carnoustie, just outside Dundee. And in 2005, a new landowner came along, decided they didn't really want huts there, raised the rents, people even paid the raised rents, then tried to evict everyone, then shut the water off, all of which was illegal. And then, when nobody was there, mysteriously, every single hut there was trashed. These had been there since 1937, and those 65 huts, you can see them there, all of them, the windows were stoved in. Nobody knows who did it. Nobody seems to care. The local MSP isn't very bothered because they're not his constituents. And those constituents, by the MPs and MSPs, back at the person's first home, well, it didn't happen on their patch, did it? It isn't in their constituency. So it's a perfect victimless crime. And shamefully, I mean, I can't believe that I live in a country in which this is true. 16 people who had huts down at Rascarroll in Galloway had the same thing happen in 2011. This is not ancient history. The same thing where perhaps a great-grandson didn't feel the affinity that the old boy had done after the war and just wanted these tatty-looking huts off his land. He wanted to build posher country cottages and make some money out of it. So he trebled the rents, people couldn't pay it. And eventually, when they figured they had no rights in law, they burnt their own huts to the ground. Because by doing that, they returned the field to a greenfield site and made him apply for planning permission to put cottages up. And he was refused. And that's what you call success. We're told very often that we live in a barren country. If you live in the Highlands, what else can you do with the glens? What else can you do with the moorlands? They're only good, really, for sporting estates. This is another important point to think about, because that's not true. It is very hard to awaken land that has been allowed to go fallow under overgrazing of sheep and deer, that's for sure. But Ron Greer and Derek Pretzwell here, who lived near Perth, had the idea that it was quite possible to regenerate these barren areas. And you've probably seen them as you go up the A9, you know, you go up, and then you get up to Dallas-Fiddle and places like that. It's just like year zero, you know, there's nothing growing, except in the central reservations where the deer can't get to, and then it's quite verdant. Anyway, they got this little patch of land, and they started planting lupins. Now this is where I came in, because lupins are my favourite flower. And what Ron was doing was, he was illegally dropping lupin seeds around here, sometimes to stabilise bits of unstable slopes. But he planted lupins and broom, and then planted trees through them. What the lupins and broom did was bring nitrogen back to the soil, raise the temperature at the roots, and create some shelter for wee trees. For the first 2 years, there was nothing but lupins. Nice. And people thought they were mad. But after 3 to 4 years, the wee trees started to come through. He planted a lot of non-native types. I think SNH were pretty hacked off. But the Norwegian maple proved to be a very strong tree, and they grew to this that you see now. This fenced-off area, where this burgeoning amount of verdant trees, was the same as the other side you can see there. That's taken 20 years to change. Now there's a point to this. There's two pretty miserable points to this. Ron's interest in life, and I think Ron would be pleased if I called him an obstinate obsessive, because I think he could think of no prouder badge. But Ron's big interest in life is fish, and particularly the Atlantic char. What the problem is for a lot of lochs is that not enough deciduous leaves are falling into the lochs, so the wee beasties that the fish feed on can't eat anything, and thus the fish can't grow. So what Ron wanted was to get deciduous trees beside lochs so we could get fish again. Why bother? Because it's not our lochs. Perhaps the reason that this has all been allowed to happen is because those people who own the lochs only come for a trophy fish. But can you imagine what could happen if communities owned these areas, if they had these fantastic, I can't do justice to the beautiful nature of that small patch of woodland. You could be coppicing the wood, you could be using it for wood-burning stoves, you could be fishing and getting good value out of the lochs, and you could be connecting with nature. They've proved it. And from that proof, they were hopeful enough to put a bid together to take about 100,000 acres of Perthshire and do the same thing. Can you think how exciting that would have been? All the kind of, the colours, the maples of the autumn period, it would have been a huge tourist attraction too. Can you see where I'm coming with this? Or where I'm going rather? Didn't happen, did it? Well, why didn't it happen? It seems that at the end there was just too much hesitation about how many noses would be put at a joint. And actually, Ron and Derek, who were they anyway? Did they have letters after their name? Were they qualified botanists? No, they'd only proved their point. They'd only shown you what could happen. So the money, in the end, wasn't forthcoming. And this is an important point, because that broke Ron, particularly. And it breaks people. It breaks people to come as far as they try to come, using the skills that are in front of them, to have somebody, always, somebody who knows that someone else is entitled, someone will block you at the end of the road. And I think that kind of hopelessness is what finds its echo in the Scottish effect.